All right, if I'm fanning, pardon me, because I am hot flashing for real. So I'm hoping that it doesn't interfere with the mic, but the struggle is real. So thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Rice Museum for having me come and speak today. So I hope that this is in keeping with the title that Jim assigned to me. But growing up in Georgetown, it was important for my mom, or to my mom, that we learn how to swim, so that my brother and I learned how to swim. So negative community experiences kept her from learning how to swim, but she didn't want to pass that fear, and she didn't want to pass that on to my brother and myself. She wanted us to have a good relationship with the water. My mother's mother, Mary Davis, not only wanted us to learn how to swim, but she wanted us to love the water, and she wanted us to love the oceans. And so she wanted us to have a positive relationships with all of the bodies of water that were around us, and there are a lot of them here in Georgetown County. So she fostered that by planning constant trips to the beach. So we were always at Huntington Beach. She would help us lambast my grandfather early in the morning and get on his boat even when he didn't want us to go. He was planning on doing scandalous things that he couldn't do because he had two or three grandkids in tow taking us to go fishing, so he couldn't hang out with his friends. She didn't know how to swim either, but my grandmother knew how to float. So sometimes she would go into the ocean and she would spend a little bit of time. She was able to kind of dive under and then flip over on her back, and she would spend time in the ocean just floating. And she told me that it was a wonderful opportunity for her to look up at the sky and calm herself and take time to talk to God. So I always thought it was a beautiful thing. And sometimes she used to just get so far out there till we thought she was going to float away. But she really did enjoy that. Of course, we had to be out of the water when she went into the water because somebody had to be watching to make sure that the kids were okay. And how many of you took those beach trips? Everybody had to hold on to the rope. When you went down to the beach, you couldn't turn loose the rope until you got where you were going. They were serious about that water. So when my mom moved us back to Georgetown from New York, one of the first things she did was signed us up for swimming lessons at a location right here in historic Georgetown. And she did this over the phone. And so we know about code switching. So she did it over the phone. The person on the other end signed us up, gave us a time, a date, and told my mom she could pay when she got there, when we all got there. But when we arrived, everything had changed. She was told that there was no room in the class for us. And the person who was there would not take her money. But if you know my mother, you know that she is not one to be denied. So she instructed my brother and myself to quickly get into the pool. She laid her money down on the table, and she sternly told the person there that her expectation was that the swimming lessons for her children would be honored. And they did. They honored the swimming lessons that day, but we didn't go back because my mom didn't feel comfortable with us being in the water around people who did not want us to be there. So my father was still living in New York at the time. And so he was a teacher, but he also ran after-school programs and summer programs where there were public pools available. And one day, he took my brother in one hand and myself in the other hand, and he just flung us into the swimming pool as far as he could. And he yelled to us, "Get back to the side the best way you know how." So it was shocking, but it wasn't afraid. We weren't afraid because my dad was a big guy and he knew how to swim, and there were people all around us who knew how to swim. And so that's how I think that was the start of me becoming a fairly decent swimmer. But that is not the case for a lot of young people who live in the Low Country, and that's not the case for a lot of Gullah Geechee children. So I hope the stats have changed, but in 2017, a study found that 70% of African Americans lack basic swimming skills, and that African American children are about 5 times more likely to drown than other people. But because Atlantic Africa has thousands of miles of coastland and rivers, and West African ancestors of Gullah Geechee people knew the water well. So they knew about water. Many of them that were enslaved and trafficked to this region were trafficked and enslaved because of their expertise and knowledge of rice growing techniques that harness the ocean and tidal rivers to cultivate a crop that is largely responsible for the economic foundation of early America. Much of the enslaved African experience in America has been presented to us in ways that intentionally strips them of who they really are. So critically thinking, problem solving, inventive, skilled, educated, cultured, self-governing, spiritual, loving people. A people with an accomplished and long history on land and on water. Africans have ancient maritime histories of travel and commerce, and have long used water as a part of their cultural and social and spiritual expressions. And when Africans were enslaved and trafficked to the Americas, they relied on the knowledge and memory of their maritime history and revived and created them in such traditions as boat building and fishing to survive here. So most ferrymen, shipmen, fishermen, trunkmen were all enslaved African peoples. Enslaved African women, especially in the Caribbean and Brazil, often were able to have a sort of autonomy because they fished and were able to sell what they caught. Many who built Georgetown Lighthouse, the Georgetown Lighthouse, were enslaved Africans. I heard stories growing up about night walking. Do we know what night walking is? So oftentimes, even if you were owned as an enslaved person by the same family, say for example, the Lynches who used to own Hopsawee Plantation, owned 7 working plantations along the Santee Delta within a 10-mile radius. And so at night, oftentimes people would walk from plantation to plantation to check on family and relatives and friends, to be there to help support someone in a birth or death. And so people would spend long amounts of time getting from place to place. And so night walking often involved night rowing and taking a walk to a body of water like the Black River or the North Santee or the South Santee and getting into a boat to get to where you needed to go quicker. So wading in water was thought to throw off the scent of dogs when there were enslaved Africans that were trying to make a break for freedom. So I mention all of these things because I question why so many African Americans stay away and keep their children away from water. And how did we get all of the stereotypes about Black people not being good swimmers and having bodies that were so too dense and not buoyant enough to move and navigate in the water? And I began to juxtapose those stereotypes to images of Africans, even today, deep diving and swimming and surfing and boating and using the water for both work and for pleasure, and understanding the water quite well, just like our ancestors did. So the question that I want to pose to everyone and maybe discuss for a little bit is, could trauma, old trauma, generational trauma, be a part of the cause of why we keep ourselves away from water and keep our children away from water. So African people have always had held a deep understanding and respect and reverence for the ocean, for her power to move and transform us. So could the collective memory of human trafficking that was the transatlantic slave trade loom so large that we begin to associate the ocean with death and pain and separation and suffering? So I just want people to just kind of sit with that question just for a little bit. So many Africans died at sea, sometimes being thrown into the ocean because they were deemed too sick or diseased to be of any value, like in the Zong massacre, or because the slave ship captains were caught and were trying to hide the fact that the human cargo that they had was illegal or contraband. Water was used to draw invisible lines that were not crossed during slavery and Jim Crow, and those invisible barriers were enforced with violence and fear. The 1919 Chicago race riots were started because two young black boys swam over to the white side of the lake or whatever they have in Chicago. One of the young men, Eugene Williams, was stoned to death by white people because he had crossed this invisible whites-only line. I have seen pictures of African American child givers in Myrtle Beach in the 1950s on Myrtle Beach, having to place a child at the water's edge and step back so that her feet would not be in the water. I learned from a tour given at Atlantic Beach with Miss Pat Millett that there was a large dune that local people called Monkey Hill, and it was the barrier that kept people in the box of Atlantic Beach. The bodies of Emmett Till and so many other young black men and women were hidden in water after their bodies they were murdered and their bodies mutilated. Black communities like Oscarville in Georgia were flooded after it was burned, completely burned because of allegations of a rape by two men of a white woman. And so that whole community was then flooded purposely by Lake Lanier. So there are a lot of instances where trauma could definitely play a part in why we now hold ourselves separate from water when our ancestors have given us such a rich maritime history. So I just want to put that out there to people if we want to talk about that or kind of deal with that. And I want to do that because it needs to change. We have to figure out solutions that will bring us back in harmony with the water. There are 6 rivers that flow through Georgetown County. The Atlantic Ocean is vast. As I said before, we come from a very rich and powerful maritime history, created millennia ago by water people who understood the water. And so we need to really focus on this question and figure out how we can change the way our relationship with water is now. So do we have any comments? Or yes?